The elderly woman's hands trembled as she fumbled with her grocery bags outside the small corner market on a Tuesday afternoon that had started like any other. She was 89 years old, moving slowly, just trying to get her week's supplies back to her car. That's when the anti-ICE activist spotted her. He was 42, wearing a faded Che Guevara shirt under an open jacket plastered with pins, demanding open borders and abolishing enforcement agencies. His hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and his eyes had that zealous glint of someone who believed his ideology gave him permission to do whatever he wanted to, whoever disagreed. He'd been canvassing the neighborhood all morning, shoving flyers into people's hands, demanding they sign petitions, getting in their faces about supporting sanctuary city policies. Most people had ignored him or brushed past quickly, but when he saw this old woman struggling with her bags, something in his activist brain decided she was the perfect target. Maybe it was her American flag pin on her cardigan. Maybe it was just that she looked vulnerable. Either way, he approached. At first, his voice was loud but attempting civility, asking if she'd sign his petition to defund ICE and demand the city refuse all cooperation with federal immigration enforcement. The old woman, Martha was her name, politely declined. She said she didn't get involved in politics, that she just wanted to get her groceries home. That should have been the end of it. But for this activist, refusal wasn't an option. His voice got louder. He stepped closer, blocking her path to her car. He started lecturing her about how people like her were complicit in concentration camps, how her silence was violence, how anyone who didn't actively fight against immigration enforcement was a fascist. The old woman tried to step around him, her voice shaking as she said she really needed to go, that her ice cream was melting. The activist grabbed one of her grocery bags, holding it hostage while he continued his tirade. Other shoppers were starting to notice, some looking concerned. But in that particular neighborhood, confronting an activist was risky business. You never knew who might record you and try to get you fired or doxxed online. The anti-IC protester was really warming up now. He started talking about Karl Marx, about the workers' revolution, about how property and borders were just constructs of the capitalist oppressor class. The old woman didn't understand half of what he was saying. She'd lived through actual hardship, through a husband who served his country, through raising kids on a modest income, through burying friends and family. She knew what real struggle looked like, and it wasn't this privileged man in expensive sneakers ranting about theory while preventing her from going home. She asked again, her voice barely above a whisper, if he would please just let her leave. The activist mocked her shaking voice, called her a relic of a dying generation, said people like her needed to get out of the way so progress could happen. He moved even closer, now standing inches from her face, and that's when his mask really slipped. He told her that her generation had ruined everything, that they'd voted for walls and cages, that maybe she should experience what immigrants experience when they're detained. The threat was clear enough. The old woman's eyes filled with tears. What this anti-ICE activist didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he was so wrapped up in his own self-righteous fury, was that Martha's son had been in the parking lot the entire time, returning from dropping off recycling at the bins around back. Her son had heard the commotion, had been walking toward them for the last 30 seconds, taking in the scene with growing disbelief. And here's where the story gets interesting, because Martha's son wasn't just any son. Her son was Chuck, but not just Chuck, Chuck Norris. Yes, that Chuck Norris. 62 years old now, gray in his beard, wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt, looking like any other father out running errands with his elderly mother. The anti-ICE activist had no idea who was approaching. All he saw was another old guy, probably coming to defend his Trump-loving mother, probably just as weak and irrelevant as she was. Chuck stopped about 10 feet away, his expression calm, his hands relaxed at his sides. He'd been a martial artist since he was 18 years old, had served in the Air Force, had made dozens of action movies, had taught self-defense to thousands of people. But more than that, he was a man who believed in respect, in civility, in the idea that you don't put your hands on people, especially not elderly women, especially not his mother. His voice when he spoke was quiet, measured, the kind of tone that people with real confidence use when they don't need to shout to be heard. He said, "Excuse me, that's my mother you're talking to." The activist spun around, still holding Martha's grocery bag, and immediately sized Chuck up with the kind of contempt that ideologues reserve for anyone they perceive as the enemy. He saw a 62-year-old man with gray hair and probably figured this would be easy. He actually laughed, a sneering, dismissive sound. The anti-ICE protester started in on Chuck immediately, saying, "Oh, great, Another boomer coming to defend his fascist mom, asking if Chuck thought he was tough, if he was going to hit him, go ahead and try it so it could be recorded and go viral. Chuck didn't move. He simply asked the activist to give his mother her bag back and step aside. The activist refused, getting louder now, sensing an audience starting to form. Someone had their phone out, which only emboldened him more. He started talking about how Chuck's generation had failed, how they were dinosaurs, how they needed to accept that times had changed, and their ideas about borders and nationalism were finished. Chuck let him talk. He'd learned a long time ago that people like this needed to exhaust themselves with words before they'd listen to anything. But when the activist reached out and actually shoved Martha's shoulder, making her stumble backward, something changed in Chuck's eyes. Not anger exactly, more like a door closing. The time for diplomacy was over. The activist must have seen something in that look, because he suddenly got more aggressive, puffing up his chest, saying, "What are you going to do, old man? You think you're still in your action movies? You think that fake Hollywood fighting means anything in real life? I bet you can't even throw a punch anymore without your stunt double." He was playing to the crowd now, people recording on their phones, probably imagining the viral video of him standing up to some old conservative nobody. Chuck took one step forward, still calm, and said one more time, "Give my mother her bag and walk away. You don't want this to go any further." The activist interpreted this as fear, as weakness, as proof that these tough-talking patriots were all bluster when confronted with real resistance. He set Martha's bag down hard on the ground, groceries spilling out, and actually pushed Chuck in the chest with both hands, not hard enough to make him stumble, but enough to make it a clear physical challenge. If you can't stand seeing these entitled activists imposing their rules and harassing decent people just trying to live their lives, if you want to see more of these ideological bullies getting a reality check they desperately need, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. We show you what the mainstream media won't, the stories they bury because it doesn't fit their narrative. Now let's get back to what happened next. The anti-ICE activist had just made the biggest mistake of his day, possibly his year, possibly his life, because the moment he laid hands on Chuck Norris, treating him like some irrelevant old man who could be intimidated with a shove, he set in motion something he was completely unprepared for. Chuck didn't respond immediately. He took a breath, and in that breath, 40-plus years of discipline and training and experience crystallized into perfect clarity. His posture shifted so subtly that most people watching wouldn't have caught it, but the weight distribution changed, the angle of his shoulders, the position of his feet. He went from looking like someone's dad to looking like what he actually was underneath the gray hair and the quiet demeanor, a weapon. The activist opened his mouth to say something else, probably another insult, another taunt, but he never got the words out. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds would be replayed on phone cameras from 4 different angles, shared millions of times, and become a permanent reminder that age doesn't erase skill, it refines it. Chuck's left hand moved first, not in a punch, but in a deflection, redirecting the activist's arm that was still extended from the shove, using the man's own forward momentum against him. Before the activist could process what was happening, Chuck's right hand had secured a grip on the back of his neck, and Chuck's leg had swept behind the activist's knee. The anti-ICE protester found himself airborne for a fraction of a heartbeat, and then he was on the ground, face down on the parking lot asphalt, with Chuck's knee pressed into his back and his arm twisted at an angle that was uncomfortable, but not quite painful. A perfect control hold that immobilized him completely without causing injury. The entire sequence had been so smooth, so precise, so utterly effortless that it looked exactly like something from one of Chuck's movies, except it was real, happening right there in a suburban parking lot over spilled groceries and hurt pride. The activist's face was pressed against the pavement, his tough guy act evaporating in real time, as he realized he couldn't move, couldn't get up, couldn't do anything except lie there, while this old man he'd been mocking seconds earlier controlled him with what seemed like minimal effort. Chuck's voice was still calm when he spoke, still measured, but there was steel underneath it now. He said, "You put your hands on my mother. You threatened an 89-year-old woman doing her shopping, and you thought there would be no consequences." The activist tried to struggle, tried to push up, but Chuck adjusted the hold with the tiniest shift of pressure, and the activist gasped, immediately going still again. The people recording on their phones were dead silent now. The energy in the parking lot completely transformed. Everyone had seen it. The moment of dismissive mockery, the shove, and then this impossibly smooth takedown that proved every joke about Chuck Norris being old and washed up was just that, a joke. Chuck kept the activist pinned for another few seconds, not hurting him, just making absolutely certain the lesson was sinking in. He said, "You wanted to know if my movie fighting was real. You wanted to test an old man. How's it working out for you?" The activist was breathing hard against the asphalt, his earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by the dawning realization that he'd picked the worst possible person to harass. Chuck continued, his voice still quiet enough that only the activist and the people closest could hear. He said, "I learned to fight when I was a teenager. I trained in Tang Soo Do for over 40 years. I earned my black belts when you were probably still in diapers. You think age makes that go away? You think because Hollywood uses stunt coordinators and special effects that the skill underneath isn't real? You made an assumption about me because I'm 62 and I don't go around advertising who I am. That assumption is why you're on the ground right now." Martha had collected her spilled groceries with the help of another shopper who'd come over, and she stood there watching her son, not with shock but with quiet satisfaction. She'd raised him to be respectful, to be kind, to avoid violence whenever possible, but she'd also raised him to stand up for what was right, to protect the vulnerable, to understand that sometimes peace has to be enforced by those capable of bringing controlled violence when all other options are exhausted. The anti-ICE activist was starting to whimper now, asking Chuck to let him go, saying he was sorry. He didn't know. He wouldn't have done it if he'd known who Chuck was. And that right there was the problem, the fundamental rot at the core of his entire worldview. He was only sorry because he'd discovered his target wasn't as weak as assumed. He wasn't sorry for harassing an elderly woman. He wasn't sorry for his ideology that told him he had the right to intimidate anyone who disagreed. He was sorry he'd been caught, sorry he'd miscalculated, sorry he was being humiliated in front of witnesses recording everything. Chuck stood up slowly, releasing the hold, and the activist scrambled to his feet, stumbling backward, his face red from the pavement and from shame. Chuck didn't pursue him. He simply stood there, hands at his sides again, and looked at the activist with something that wasn't quite pity but close to it. He said, "You talk about justice and equality, about fighting for the oppressed, but the first thing you did when you saw someone vulnerable was to victimize them. You hide behind ideology because it gives you permission to be cruel, to be a bully, to feel righteous while you make people afraid. That's not activism. That's not fighting for anything except your own ego." The activist tried to muster some defiance, started to say something about how Chuck didn't understand the struggle, about how people like him were part of the system that needed to be dismantled. Chuck cut him off, his voice harder now. He said, "I understand struggle just fine. I grew up poor. I served my country. I worked for everything I have. I didn't demand the world hand me anything. I didn't terrorize grandmothers to feel important." The crowd was still recording, still watching, and the activist was starting to realize the video of this encounter wasn't going to play out the way he'd imagined. This wasn't going to be footage of him bravely confronting a conservative patriarch. This was going to be footage of him getting put on the ground by a 62-year-old after harassing an elderly woman. This was going to be a humiliation he'd never lived down in his activist circles. Chuck stepped closer, and the activist flinched, actually flinched, backing up against someone's parked car. Chuck said, "You want to talk about Karl Marx and workers' revolution." Marx was a man who never did a day of hard labor in his life, who sponged off his friends, whose own family suffered while he wrote theory. You idolize a man who had no practical understanding of the world he claimed to want to save. You're the same. You don't want to actually help anyone. You want to feel superior. You want to tear down without building anything to replace it. The activist was looking around now, hoping for support from the crowd, but nobody was stepping forward. A few people were nodding along with Chuck's words. Others just looked disgusted at what they'd witnessed. An anti-ICE protester targeting a frail old woman because she wouldn't sign his petition. Chuck continued, pressing his point home. He said, "You know what the difference is between me and you. I can sleep at night. I can look my family in the eye. I built things. I taught people. I contributed. What do you contribute besides noise and harassment? When you're my age, what will you have to show for your life besides video of you getting dropped on your face in a parking lot because you threatened someone's mother?" The activist's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Everything he'd believed about himself, about his movement, about his moral authority, was crashing down under the weight of reality. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was a bully who'd picked the wrong target. Martha spoke then, her voice still shaky but stronger than before. She said, "Young man, I've lived through wars and recessions and the death of everyone I loved growing up. I don't need you to tell me how the world works. I don't need your revolution. What I needed was to take my groceries home in peace." Chuck put his arm around his mother's shoulders, gently guiding her toward her car, picking up the last of her scattered items. He glanced back at the activist one more time and said, "You have a choice now. You can learn something from this. Recognize that intimidation isn't activism, and that respect isn't a tool of oppression. Or you can go back to your echo chamber and tell yourself you were the victim here, that I'm the bad guy, that nothing needs to change in how you treat people. But I promise you this, the world doesn't work the way you think it does. Sooner or later, everyone who acts like you did today runs into someone who won't be pushed around. You got lucky. I'm 62 and I still believe in restraint. The next person might not be." The anti-ICE activist stood there, breathing hard, his expensive sneakers scuffed, his ideology in tatters, watching as Chuck helped his mother into her car, loaded her groceries into the trunk, and closed the door gently. The crowd was dispersing now, people putting away their phones, shaking their heads, some of them clearly pleased at what they'd witnessed. One older gentleman approached Chuck and shook his hand, saying thank you for showing that punk what's what. Chuck just nodded, not interested in being celebrated, just wanting to make sure his mother was all right. As he walked around to the driver's side, the activist finally found his voice again, shouting after him something about how this wasn't over, about how there would be consequences, about how his people would hear about this. Chuck didn't even turn around. He just got in the car and drove away. The parking lot returned to normal within minutes, people going about their business. But the video was already uploading, already being shared, already making its way across social media platforms where it would rack up millions of views. The comments would be predictable. Thousands of people celebrating seeing an activist get exactly what he'd been asking for. Others trying to spin it as an attack, as violence against peaceful protesters. But the footage didn't lie. It showed clearly who the aggressor was, showed clearly who'd put hands on whom first, showed clearly that Chuck had tried to de-escalate before using the absolute minimum force necessary to protect his mother and restore order. It showed that all the tough talk and ideological posturing in the world doesn't matter when faced with someone who actually knows what they're doing, someone whose skills aren't theoretical but proven through decades of discipline. That night, Martha sat in her living room with a cup of tea, her groceries put away, her ice cream successfully saved, and she thought about the confrontation. She thought about how the world had changed, how people who claim to be fighting for justice seemed to have forgotten what justice actually meant. Justice wasn't terrorizing the vulnerable. Justice wasn't using ideology as an excuse to be cruel. Justice was what her son had delivered that afternoon in a parking lot, proportional, controlled, and utterly devastating to someone who'd needed to learn that actions have consequences. She thought about how the activist had been so surprised, so unprepared for the reality that his worldview didn't match the actual world. That's what happens when you spend all your time in echo chambers, when you're surrounded only by people who tell you you're right, you're righteous, you're on the right side of history. You forget that history doesn't care about your theories, and the real world has a way of teaching lessons that theory never prepared you for. Chuck didn't think about it much at all. For him, it had been simple, automatic, muscle memory from a lifetime of training. Someone threatened his mother. He responded appropriately. He didn't hurt the guy, didn't seek to humiliate him beyond what was necessary to end the threat and make the point. He'd offered diplomatic exits right up until physical contact was made, and even then he'd used a control hold rather than a strike. That's discipline. That's what separates trained, principled people from thugs and bullies. The anti-ICE activist would have his bruised ego and his viral humiliation to deal with, but he'd walk away without injury, which was more mercy than he'd been prepared to show an 89-year-old woman with trembling hands and grocery bags. The video would follow him for years, a permanent reminder that real strength doesn't come from ideology or volume or aggression. Real strength comes from discipline, from respect, from the willingness to protect without the desire to destroy. The story spread beyond social media into news coverage, into discussions about political violence and activist tactics, into debates about self-defense and proportional response. But underneath all the noise and the takes and the commentary, the simple truth remained clear. A man who believed his cause justified intimidation had learned the hard way that the world still values honor, that age doesn't equal weakness, that respect isn't negotiable, and that sometimes justice arrives not from institutions or legislation, but from a 62-year-old martial artist in a parking lot who just wanted to take his mother grocery shopping. Western civilization, for all its flaws and complications, still runs on principles that no amount of revolutionary rhetoric can erase. Principles like protecting the weak, respecting the elderly, and understanding that might without right is just tyranny by another name.